He was 51 years old when he bought it, September 1986, a Saturday afternoon in Turner County, South Dakota. The kind of day where the sun sits heavy and the wind doesn't move and you can hear a diesel engine from 2 miles off. Harold Vance stood in the gravel lot of an estate auction with his arms crossed, watching a New Holland round baler roll past on a flatbed trailer. The auctioneer hadn't called it yet. Harold didn't bid on things early. He watched. The baler was a 1982 model, not new, but not used up either. Paint still bright in the places that mattered. Belts looked tight, pickup teeth straight, the kind of machine that had been maintained by someone who knew what they were doing and didn't wait until something broke to care about it. Harold had seen plenty of balers that looked good from a distance and fell apart under a day's work. This one didn't look like that. The auction was for a man named Eugene Carlson. Harold didn't know him well, but he knew the name. Carlson had run cattle and put up his own hay for 30 years on a place just south of Hurley. No sons, no one to take it over. Cancer took him in July. His wife moved to Sioux Falls to live with her sister, and now everything he'd ever owned was sitting in rows waiting to be sold to strangers. Harold had come to the auction because he needed a baler. His old pull-type New Holland had finally given out after 19 seasons. The chain drive had snapped in the middle of second cutting, and when he pulled the covers off to assess the damage, he found cracks in the frame he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't worth fixing. He knew that. He'd known it for 2 years, but admitting it and replacing it were two different things. He ran a cow-calf operation on 640 acres, grassland mostly, some alfalfa, enough hay ground to feed his own herd through the winter if the weather cooperated and the equipment didn't fail. He didn't sell hay, didn't have time for that. The hay he baled was the hay his cattle ate, and if he couldn't bale it himself, he had to buy it. And buying hay in a bad year could put you under faster than anything else. Harold was not a man who borrowed money if he could help it. His father had taught him that. You buy what you can afford, and you make it last, and you don't sign your name to something you can't pay off in a year. Harold had followed that rule since 1967, when he'd taken over the home place after his father's heart attack. He'd bought used equipment, fixed what broke, learned to weld, learned to machine parts, learned to make things work longer than they were supposed to. It wasn't pride, it was survival. But this baler, this one sitting on the trailer in front of him, this was different. It was a round baler. Harold had always used a square baler. Squares stacked, squares fit in the barn. Squares were what he knew. But rounds were faster. You could leave them in the field if you had to. Less labor. One man could do the work of two. Harold had thought about switching for years, but the cost always stopped him. A good round baler, even used, ran more than he wanted to spend. The auctioneer climbed up on the flatbed. He ran through the specs, hours, condition, service history. He mentioned that Carlson had kept all the manuals, all the maintenance records, everything in a binder in the shop. Someone in the crowd laughed and said that sounded like Eugene. The auctioneer started the bidding at $3,500. Harold didn't move. The bidding climbed. $4,000, $4,500, $5,000. A dealer from Yankton raised his card. Another farmer Harold didn't recognize stayed in. The auctioneer worked them both back and forth, his voice rising and falling in that rhythm that makes you feel like you're missing something if you don't act. At $6,000, the dealer dropped out. At $6,500, the other farmer hesitated. Harold raised his hand. The auctioneer pointed at him. $6,550, now seven, who'll give me $7? The other farmer shook his head and walked away. Sold, the auctioneer said. $6,550 to the gentleman in the blue cap. Harold walked to the clerk's table and wrote a check. It cleared his checking account down to $800. He didn't finance it. He didn't talk to the bank. He paid in full, signed the paper, and drove the baler home on the back of his flatbed before the sun went down. His wife, Karen, was in the garden when he pulled into the yard. She straightened up and watched him back the baler off the trailer. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Harold knew what the checkbook looked like. He knew what $6,000 meant in September when the calves hadn't sold yet and the propane bill was coming. But he also knew what it cost to buy hay all winter, and he knew what happened to men who ran out of options. "It's a good machine," he said. Karen pulled off her gloves. "I hope so." That was all she said. He used it for the first time in June of 1987. Second cutting. The alfalfa came off thick and clean, and the baler ran without a hitch. Harold spent the first hour just listening to it. The way the pickup pulled the windrow in, the way the belts tensed and released, the way the bale chamber filled and the twine knotted, and the finished bale rolled out onto the stubble like something inevitable. It was faster than the square baler. A lot faster. He could cover 40 acres in a day by himself, and the bales were tight and dry and exactly the size he wanted. He didn't have to stack them, didn't have to haul them to the barn that same week. He left them in the field for 3 days, let them cure, then hauled them in when the weather looked right. By the end of that summer, Harold had put up more hay than he'd ever managed before. He fed his herd through the winter without buying a single bale. The cows stayed healthy. The calves came strong in the spring. And when he looked at the New Holland sitting in the shed in March, still clean, still tight, still ready, he felt something he didn't feel often. He felt like he'd made the right choice. The years that followed were not easy years, but they were years he got through. In 1988, the drought hit. Hay ground that should have given him 3 cuttings gave him 1. He baled what he could and bought the rest, but the baler kept running, and that mattered. A machine that doesn't break down in a bad year is worth more than a machine that runs perfect when everything else is going right. In 1991, cattle prices dropped hard. Harold sold his calves at a loss and had to pull money from savings to cover the shortfall. But he didn't sell equipment. He didn't liquidate. He kept the baler, kept the tractor, kept everything running, and he made it to the next year. In 1994, Karen was diagnosed with breast cancer. The treatments were in Sioux Falls, an hour and a half each way. Harold drove her twice a week for 6 months. He baled hay in the early mornings and late evenings, whenever he could grab 4 hours of decent weather. The New Holland didn't care what time of day it was. It started, it ran, it finished the job. Karen recovered. The cancer didn't come back. But the medical bills didn't go away fast, and Harold learned what it meant to live with debt you couldn't pay off in a year. He made payments, he kept current, he didn't miss a single one. But it changed something in him. He started to understand that survival wasn't just about avoiding loans. It was about keeping the tools you needed to keep going. The baler was one of those tools. By the year 2000, Harold was 65 years old. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations, and it looked like it might end with him. His son, Trevor, had gone to college in Brookings and never came back. He worked for an insurance company in Rapid City. He called on holidays. He didn't ask about the farm. His daughter, Meg, had stayed closer. She lived in Sioux Falls and worked as a physical therapist. She visited every few weeks, helped her mother with the garden, sat with Harold on the porch, and listened to him talk about the herd, the grass, the equipment. She didn't farm. She'd never wanted to. But she cared about the place in a way Trevor didn't, and Harold knew that mattered, even if he didn't know what it would mean later. In 2004, Harold had a stroke. It was mild, the doctors said. He'd recover most of his strength, but his balance was off, and his left hand didn't work the way it used to, and climbing on and off a tractor became something he had to think about instead of something he just did. He kept farming. He hired a neighbor kid to help with haying. He moved slower. He rested more. But he didn't quit. In 2007, he had another stroke. This one was worse. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital and another month in rehab. When he came home, he couldn't walk without a cane, and he couldn't operate the baler anymore. His hands shook. His depth perception was gone. He tried once, in late June, to hook up the New Holland and make a pass through the south field. He got the baler lined up behind the tractor, got the PTO engaged, got 20 yards into the windrow, and then couldn't tell where the pickup was. He clipped a fence post he'd driven past 1,000 times and had to shut everything down. Trevor came out that weekend. He and Harold sat in the kitchen and talked about options. Trevor suggested selling the cows, selling the equipment, leasing the ground to a neighbor and moving into town. Harold didn't argue. He didn't have the strength. But he didn't agree either. Meg came out the next weekend. She sat with her father on the porch, and he told her he didn't know what to do. He wasn't ready to quit, but he couldn't do the work anymore, and hiring help cost more than the operation brought in. "What do you want to happen?" Meg asked. Harold looked out at the shed where the New Holland was parked. "I want the place to keep going," he said. "Even if it's not you running it?" He didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. "Yeah, even then." Meg didn't make any promises, but she started coming out more often. She started learning how things worked. She asked questions, she watched, and in the spring of 2008, when Harold couldn't do it anymore, she took a leave of absence from her job and moved back to the farm. She didn't know how to farm. She didn't know how to run a baler. She didn't know how to read the weather or judge when the hay was dry enough to cut, or how to tell if a bale was going to shed water or soak it up and rot from the inside. But she learned. Harold sat in the passenger seat of the pickup and talked her through it. Where to start? How to watch the windrow. How to listen to the baler and know when the chamber was full. How to tie off a broken belt in the field if you had to. How to keep going when the weather turned and you had 3 hours of daylight left and 20 acres still down. Meg made mistakes. She missed windows. She baled hay too green once and had to throw out 15 bales that molded. She ran the baler too fast and sheared a pin on the pickup, but she kept at it, and by the end of that first summer, she'd put up enough hay to feed the herd through the winter. Harold watched from the porch. He couldn't help anymore. Couldn't climb into the cab, couldn't check the bales, but he could see the New Holland moving through the field, the same machine he'd bought 22 years earlier, still running, still doing the work it was built to do. He died in November of 2008, quietly, in his sleep. Karen found him in the morning. The funeral was small, family, neighbors, a few men from the auction barn. The pastor talked about stewardship and legacy and faithfulness. Meg sat in the front row and didn't cry. She'd done her crying already. After the service, Trevor pulled her aside. He told her it was time to sell. The cows, the equipment, the land. Their mother didn't need the place anymore, and neither did Meg. She had a career, a life in Sioux Falls. There was no reason to keep pretending this was sustainable. Meg looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I'm not selling." Trevor didn't argue. He went back to Rapid City and Meg went back to the farm. She kept it going. She sold her house in Sioux Falls and moved into the farmhouse full-time. She went back to work part-time at the clinic 3 days a week and spent the other 4 on the farm. She ran the same herd her father had run. She baled the same fields. She used the same equipment. The New Holland was 30 years old by then. Parts were harder to find. Belts wore out faster. The pickup teeth bent more easily. But Meg learned how to fix it. She learned how to order parts. She learned how to pull the baler apart in the shed in February and replace the bearings and grease the chains and get it ready for the next season. In 2012, a neighbor offered to buy the baler. He said he'd give her $4,000 for it, cash, and she could use the money to buy something newer. Meg thanked him and said no. In 2015, a dealer in Yankton told her the model she had wasn't worth fixing anymore. Too old. Too many hours. Parts discontinued. She should trade it in and finance something current. Meg listened politely and drove home. In 2018, her mother passed away. Karen had been in declining health for 2 years, and the end came gently. Meg buried her next to Harold and kept farming. By 2020, Meg was 53 years old. She'd been running the farm for 12 years. The herd was smaller now, the operation leaner. She didn't make much money, but she didn't lose money either, and in a climate where most small cattle operations were disappearing, that felt like something. The New Holland was 38 years old. It had baled hay under 3 different owners, Eugene Carlson, Harold Vance, and now Meg. It had outlasted all of them in one way or another. Meg didn't think about that much. She didn't sentimentalize the machine. It wasn't a monument. It was a tool. But it was a tool that worked, and in a life where so many things didn't work anymore, markets, weather, relationships, plans, that mattered more than she knew how to explain. In June of 2020, the baler broke down. Not catastrophically, not in a way that ended anything, but enough to stop. Meg was in the middle of first cutting when the main drive belt snapped. She shut everything down, climbed off the tractor, and looked at the damage. The belt had shredded. Pieces of it were wrapped around the pulley. The tensioner arm had bent. It wasn't something she could fix in the field. She called the dealer in Yankton. They didn't have the belt in stock. They could order it, but it would take 2 weeks, maybe 3. And the tensioner arm, well, that part had been discontinued in 2003. They could try to find a used one, but no guarantees. Meg thanked them and hung up. She spent the next 2 days calling salvage yards, other dealers, farmers she knew who might have parts sitting in a shed somewhere. She finally found a belt in Iowa and a tensioner arm in Nebraska. She paid for expedited shipping and waited. The parts arrived on a Friday. Meg spent Saturday morning in the shed, pulling the baler apart, replacing the belt, straightening the tensioner arm as best she could, putting everything back together. It took 6 hours. When she was done, her hands were covered in grease and her back ached, and she wasn't sure the repair would hold. She hooked the baler up to the tractor and drove it out to the field. She engaged the PTO. The belts turned. The pickup dropped. She eased forward into the windrow and watched the hay pull in. The baler ran. It ran rough. It made a noise it hadn't made before, a kind of rhythmic knock that Meg couldn't place. But it ran. It filled the chamber. It wrapped the twine. It dropped the bale. She finished the field that afternoon. 43 bales. Good, tight, dry. When she parked the New Holland back in the shed that evening, she stood there for a long time, just looking at it. The paint was faded. The decals were half gone. The frame had rust spots. The tires were worn down to the cords in places. It didn't look like much, but it had done the job. Again. That summer, Meg started thinking about what would happen when the baler finally quit for good. She was 53. She didn't have kids. She didn't have anyone lined up to take over the farm. Trevor had made it clear years ago that he wasn't interested. Her mother's family was gone. Her father's cousins were scattered across 3 states, none of them farming. The farm would end with her. She knew that. She'd known it for a long time. But the baler, she didn't know what would happen to the baler. She thought about it while she was feeding cattle. She thought about it while she was fixing fence. She thought about it at night when she couldn't sleep and the wind rattled the windows and the coyotes called from the ridge. The machine had outlasted Eugene Carlson. It had outlasted Harold Vance. It would outlast her too. And when it did, when she was gone, and the farm was sold and the equipment was auctioned off, someone else would buy it. Someone who didn't know Eugene or Harold or her. Someone who just needed a baler and didn't care about the history. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Not because the machine was special. It wasn't. It was just a baler. But because it had been the thing that kept going when everything else fell apart. It had been the thing her father trusted, the thing he'd paid for in full, the thing he'd kept running long enough to hand it down, even if he'd never intended to. And now it was hers, and she was keeping it running. Not because it was new, not because it was easy, but because it worked, and because letting it go felt like letting go of something larger than metal and belts and hydraulic lines. In the fall of 2020, Meg was baling the last cutting of the season when a truck pulled into the field. She didn't recognize it. She finished the bale she was working on, disengaged the PTO, and climbed down. A man got out of the truck. He was older, maybe 70. He walked with a limp. He introduced himself as Gene Carlson Jr. Meg shook his hand. "Eugene's son?" "Yeah." He nodded toward the baler. "That was my dad's." Meg didn't know what to say. "I heard you still had it," Gene said. "Heard you were still using it. I wanted to see it." They walked over to the New Holland. Gene ran his hand along the frame, the same way someone might touch a headstone. He pointed to a dent near the hitch. "I remember when that happened. Dad backed into a post in '84. He was so mad at himself." Meg smiled. "It still runs." "I can see that." Gene looked at her. "You keep it in good shape." "I try." Gene was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad bought that baler the year I left for the Navy. I wanted him to wait, you know? I thought maybe I'd come back and we'd farm together. But he said he couldn't wait. He needed it that summer." "Did you come back?" Gene shook his head. "No, I stayed in, 22 years. By the time I retired, he was already sick. I'm sorry." Gene shrugged. "It's just how it went." They stood there for a while, not saying anything. The wind moved through the dry grass. The sky was enormous and empty. Finally, Jean said, "You planning to keep it?" "As long as it runs," Meg said. Jean nodded. "Good. I'm glad it ended up with someone who uses it." He got back in his truck and drove away. Meg watched him go. Then she climbed back on the tractor and finished the field. By the spring of 2023, the New Holland was 41 years old. Meg was 56. Her knees hurt. Her back hurt. She'd started thinking about what came next, though she didn't have an answer yet. The baler was still running. Barely. She'd replaced the belts twice in the last 3 years. The pickup was held together with welds and hope. The twine arms didn't always tie correctly, and she had to stop every 5th or 6th bale to adjust them by hand. It was slow. It was frustrating. It would have been easier to replace it. But she didn't. She didn't because the machine still worked. And because her father had bought it with money he didn't have to spare. And because he'd kept it running long enough for her to inherit it. And because she'd kept it running long enough to prove that his choice, whatever it had cost him, hadn't been wasted. She didn't know if that mattered to anyone else. She didn't know if it even mattered to her, in any way she could explain. But when she hooked the baler up in late May and drove it out to the field for the first time that season, and when the belts turned and the hay pulled in and the bale chamber filled, she felt something she didn't feel anywhere else. She felt like she was still connected to something. Not to the past, exactly. Not to her father or his memory or the idea of legacy, but to the work, to the rhythm of it. To the simple fact that hay needed to be baled and cattle needed to be fed, and there was a machine that could do the job, and she knew how to run it. In the summer of 2024, Meg put the farm up for sale. Not because she wanted to, but because the math didn't work anymore. Cattle prices hadn't kept up with costs. Property taxes kept climbing. She was tired. She'd done this for 16 years, and she didn't have another 16 in her. A young couple from Minnesota bought the place in October. They planned to run cattle and horses. They seemed kind. They asked good questions. They walked the fields with Meg and listened when she explained how the water ran and where the grass came in best and which fence lines needed attention. They didn't ask about the equipment. Meg sold most of it at auction in November. The tractor, the stock trailer, the feeders, the smaller tools. She kept a few things. Her father's toolbox, a pair of fencing pliers, a hat he used to wear, and she kept the baler. She didn't list it, didn't put it in the auction. When the auctioneer asked if she was including it, she said no. The young couple who bought the farm didn't need it. They had their own equipment. They didn't ask why she was keeping it, and she didn't explain. She had it hauled to a storage unit outside Sioux Falls. Climate-controlled, secure, expensive. More expensive than it made sense to spend on a 42-year-old baler that didn't run half the time. But she paid for it anyway. She doesn't know what she'll do with it. She doesn't have land to use it on. She doesn't have cattle to feed. She doesn't have anyone to pass it to. But she hasn't been able to let it go. Not yet. Sometimes on weekends, she drives out to the storage unit and unlocks the door and just looks at it. The faded green paint, the worn tires, the frame her father touched and her hands have touched and Eugene Carlson's hands touched before either of them. It doesn't mean anything to anyone else. She knows that, but it means something to her. It means her father made a choice in 1986 that he couldn't have known would matter 38 years later. It means he bought a machine that worked and he kept it working, and when he couldn't work anymore, someone else did. It means iron doesn't care who's gone. It doesn't grieve. It doesn't remember. It doesn't care if you kept it running out of love or stubbornness or the simple fact that you didn't know what else to do. It just sits there, waiting. And Meg doesn't know if that's a comfort or a burden. She doesn't know if keeping the machine running honored her father's memory or if it just proved she was too stubborn to let anything go. She doesn't know if the baler that outlasted its owner is a tribute to good decisions or a reminder that the things we choose to keep don't always know when to stop. All she knows is this: the New Holland is still here. Her father is not. And she can't quite bring herself to believe that one of those things matters more than the other.